The kettle had already boiled twice, but I hadn't noticed. It was one of those quiet evenings where nothing important is supposed to happen. The radio was on low volume. News. Always news back then. Politics, borders, tensions. The Cold War was nearing its end, but nobody knew that yet. I was sorting through old mail when I saw the envelope. No return address. Foreign stamp. My brother's name, spelled slightly wrong. That should have been the moment I stopped breathing. But when something dangerous enters your life slowly, it doesn't feel dangerous at all. It feels confusing. Let me ask you something. What would you do if the person you grew up with, the person who shared your childhood, your food, your secrets, had been lying to you for 20 years? Not lying about money. Not lying about love. Lying about who he really was. Because this story is not about spies. It's about family. And what happens when trust dies quietly. Before there were secrets, before there were borders and ideologies, there were just two brothers in a small house on the edge of town. We grew up in a place where nothing ever seemed important enough to remember. Our father worked long hours. Our mother kept the house together with routines and rules. Dinner at 6. Homework after. Lights off by 10. My brother, Daniel, was older than me by 4 years. To everyone else, he was the calm one. To me, he was the one who always noticed things. He noticed when our father came home tired, but pretended not to be. He noticed when our mother smiled, but was worried. He noticed things I never did. As kids, I talked too much. Daniel didn't talk much at all. But when he did speak, people listened. We shared a room. 2 beds. 1 window. At night, while I complained about school or friends, Daniel would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radio we weren't supposed to keep on after bedtime. I used to ask him what he was thinking. He always said the same thing. Nothing important. Looking back now, I understand how practiced that answer was. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the world outside our house felt distant but heavy. You heard words like Soviets, missiles, Berlin, without really understanding them. They floated through the house like background noise, serious but abstract. Daniel paid attention. He clipped newspaper articles. He memorized maps. He learned languages from library books. No one thought that was strange. Smart kids did things like that. Ambitious kids. And Daniel was ambitious, just quietly so. When he graduated high school, he didn't celebrate much. No party. No big plans. He simply told us he'd been accepted into a government-sponsored program overseas. Just temporary, he said. Our mother cried. Our father nodded, proud but distant. And I believed him when he said he'd be back soon. That's the thing about family. You believe them even when you shouldn't. The first few years, letters came regularly. Long letters. Carefully written. He talked about work in vague terms. Cultural exchange. Analysis. Translation. Never details. Never names. When I asked questions, he'd change the subject. I can't talk about that stuff, he'd say lightly. You know how government jobs are. I didn't know, but I accepted it. Because questioning him felt like betrayal. Years passed. Then more years. Daniel missed weddings. Missed funerals. Missed birthdays. When he did show up, he felt adjusted. Like someone who had learned how to blend in perfectly. He laughed at the right moments. Asked the right questions. But something was always just slightly off. Not enough to accuse. Just enough to remember. Our parents aged faster than they should have. Our mother passed first. Daniel flew in for the funeral, stayed exactly 2 days, and left without saying where he was going next. At the airport, I asked him directly, "When will you come back for good?" He smiled at me, the same smile from our childhood. "Soon," he said. He said that word like it meant nothing. 20 years went by that way. 20 years of normal life layered over unanswered questions. And here's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. Secrets don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly in an envelope. I turned the letter over again, sitting alone in my kitchen, listening to the radio talk about collapsing borders and changing alliances. Daniel's name was there, but the handwriting wasn't his, and the stamp wasn't American. That was the first time I allowed myself to think something I had avoided for 2 decades. What if I never really knew my brother at all? At that moment, I still didn't know he was a Soviet spy. I didn't know about code names. I didn't know about sleeper cells. I didn't know about classified files or intelligence handlers. All I knew was this. Something about my brother's life did not add up. And once that thought enters your mind, it never leaves. You start replaying memories differently. You hear old conversations with new ears. You notice how often he avoided simple answers. That night, I didn't open the letter. I left it on the table because part of me understood something my heart wasn't ready to accept yet. Some truths don't destroy you when you learn them. They destroy you while you're avoiding them. And that was only the beginning. The strange thing about doubt is that it doesn't arrive as fear. It arrives as inconvenience. A thought you wish you didn't have. A question you'd rather not ask. Something that interrupts the comfortable story you've been telling yourself for years. The letter stayed on my kitchen table for 3 days. I walked past it every morning. I poured coffee beside it. I pretended it was just another piece of mail waiting for the weekend. Because opening it meant admitting that something in my life had already gone wrong. When I finally did open it, there was nothing dramatic inside. No confession, no threat, no explanation. Just a short message written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. I hope you are well. I apologize for the delay. Circumstances have been complicated. Please forward any correspondence to the address below. That was it. No signature. Only an address, Eastern Europe. I read it twice. Then a third time. It wasn't what the letter said that bothered me. It was what it didn't say. No reference to our parents. No mention of the past. No warmth. It read like a business transaction. That was the moment something shifted. Not panic. Not anger. Distance. I tried to explain it away the way people always do when reality becomes uncomfortable. He's been away too long. He's changed. Government work does that to people. That explanation worked for exactly 1 day. After that, my mind started doing something I hadn't allowed it to do in 20 years. It started reviewing. I thought about Daniel's visits home, how precise they were. 2 days, 3 at most, always with a reason, always with a flight already booked. I thought about how he never talked about colleagues, never complained about work, never mentioned supervisors or frustrations. People who live normal lives complain constantly. Daniel never did. I pulled out an old box from the closet. The one every family has. Photographs, cards, paper folded too many times. Daniel's letters were all there. Same tone, same distance, same careful neutrality. Even his handwriting barely changed over 2 decades. That should have been impossible. I didn't want to think about spies. That idea belonged in movies, not kitchens and family photo albums. But something else bothered me even more. Daniel never asked for anything. Not help, not advice, not money. He existed independently of everyone else, as if family was a concept he had already outgrown. The next week, I made a phone call I had avoided for years. I contacted the agency he claimed to work for. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I asked a simple, polite question. I'm trying to update some emergency contact information for my brother. There was a pause on the line, just a second too long. Then the voice said, "We don't have a record under that name." That was the moment the ground shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough to make you feel unstable. I thanked the woman and hung up. For a long time, I sat there staring at the phone. Because when a stranger tells you something that contradicts the story your family has been living for decades, your first instinct isn't to believe the stranger. It's to protect the lie. I told myself the records must be outdated, or classified, or incomplete. That night, the television was filled with news from Europe. Walls coming down, governments collapsing, men in suits talking about the end of an era. The Cold War was changing, and I began to wonder if Daniel's silence had been tied to something much larger than us. Over the next few weeks, small details started stacking up. His travel dates overlapped in ways they shouldn't have. Addresses changed without explanation. Names of institutions didn't match public records. Nothing illegal, just impossible. The hardest part was realizing how hard I had worked not to see these things earlier. There's a kind of loyalty that becomes self-deception. You don't protect people by ignoring the truth. You protect yourself from losing them. I wanted to confront him, but confrontation requires certainty. And certainty terrified me, because once you know the truth, you don't get to choose what it costs you. One evening, while going through old photographs, I found something I had never noticed before. A picture from the late 1970s. Daniel, standing slightly apart from the rest of us, hands in his pockets, watching, not participating. Behind him, barely visible, was a man I didn't recognize. I turned the photo over. A name was written in pencil, not Daniel's. I sat there holding the photograph, feeling something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Grief, not for something lost, but for something that might never have existed. I thought about all the conversations we never had, all the questions I didn't ask because they felt impolite, unnecessary, or disloyal. I thought about how easy it is to live beside someone and still never know them. That night, I realized something important. Whatever Daniel was involved in, it hadn't just shaped his life. It had shaped mine. I had built my understanding of family around a person who might not have been real in the way I thought he was. And that realization doesn't make you angry. It makes you tired, because now you have a choice. You can keep pretending, or you can keep digging. And digging means accepting that the story you grew up with may collapse completely. A few days later, I received a phone call. No introduction, just a calm voice. Stop asking questions. The line went dead. I didn't know who had called, but I knew who the call was about. For the first time, the fear became real. Not fear of governments or secrets. Fear of losing the last version of my brother that still felt familiar. Because whatever Daniel had been doing for 20 years, it was no longer just a secret. It was coming for me too. And I understood something then that I wish I had understood much earlier. The most dangerous lies are the ones that let you live comfortably for years before asking for payment all at once. There's a moment in every discovery where you stop pretending you're just curious. That moment came for me on a Sunday afternoon, standing in line at the public records office, holding a form I had filled out 3 times because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Up until then, I had told myself a comforting lie. I'm just being careful. I'm just checking details. I'm not accusing anyone. But the truth was simpler and harder. I was looking for proof. Because once suspicion takes root, your mind doesn't want reassurance. It wants clarity, even if clarity hurts. The woman behind the counter asked for my ID. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She just stamped the paper and slid it back. Processing time is a few weeks, she said. I nodded, thanked her, and walked out feeling embarrassed by my own paranoia. And then, 2 weeks later, the envelope arrived. Inside was a thin folder. Birth records, travel entries, residency permits. Daniel's name appeared on every page. But the dates didn't agree. One document placed him in West Germany in 1978. Another showed him entering Hungary the same week. That's not unusual if you travel a lot. What is unusual is when the same person crosses 2 borders on the same day, using 2 different spellings of his own name. I sat at my desk, rereading the pages, waiting for a reasonable explanation to present itself. None did. Instead, my memory began doing something cruel. It started cooperating. I remembered how Daniel never corrected people when they mispronounced his name overseas. How he once joked that names were flexible. How he always carried more than one form of identification. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now it felt deliberate. I told myself to stop, to put the papers away and move on. But once the mind shifts into analysis, stopping feels irresponsible, like ignoring smoke in a closed room. I began checking things quietly. University records, old employer references, archived directories. Every time I expected to hit a wall, I didn't. Instead, I found gaps. Clean gaps. As if someone had intentionally removed the mess. No scandals. No mistakes. Just absences. That was the detail that scared me most. Normal lives are messy. Daniel's wasn't. Late one night, I spread the documents across my dining table. The same table where we had eaten birthday cakes, argued over politics, and planned holidays we never took. I stared at the papers until the words blurred. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A name in the margin of one form. Not Daniel's. Not anyone I recognized. But appeared more than once. Always near his. Always slightly offset. As if it weren't meant to draw attention. I wrote it down. The next morning, I searched for it. That's when I found the photograph. An old, black and white image attached to a declassified file. Poor quality. Blurred edges. But unmistakable. Daniel. Older. Thinner. watching something outside the frame. The name beneath the photo was not his. And yet, it was him. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. Because this was the moment the story stopped being theoretical. This was not confusion. This was not bureaucracy. This was intention. I thought about calling him immediately, demanding answers, forcing the truth into the open. But I didn't. Because there are two kinds of truths. The kind you confront, and the kind that, once spoken, permanently rearrange your life. I wasn't ready for the second kind. Instead, I began to watch him more carefully during our next conversation. We spoke on the phone 2 weeks later. His voice was calm, familiar, controlled. He asked about my job, about my health, about trivial things. He did not ask what I had been doing, and I realized then that he didn't need to. He already knew. That frightened me more than the documents, because it meant the distance between us wasn't accidental. It was managed. During that call, I said something small and deliberate. I ran into someone from your old program. They asked about you. There was a pause, barely a second, but I heard it. People trained to hide things don't react loudly. They react precisely. He recovered quickly. Oh, he said, that's interesting. Then he changed the subject. I didn't press, but my hands were cold when the call ended. I began sleeping poorly, not because I was afraid of danger, but because I was afraid of memory. Every recollection felt unreliable now. Every shared moment carried a question mark. Had he been acting then too? Or had he been my brother once, and something else later? That question matters. Because if he had always been pretending, then the loss was total. But if he had changed, then maybe there was still something human underneath the role. I wanted to believe the second option. People don't like thinking the people they love were never real. I made one last inquiry. Carefully, indirectly. A retired civil servant I knew through a friend. I didn't give Daniel's name. I didn't say spy. I described a pattern. Long-term overseas placement. Multiple identities. Minimal personal ties. The man listened quietly. Then he said something that settled into me like weight. Whoever you're describing, he said, wasn't living a life. He was maintaining a position. I thanked him and left. On the walk home, I understood something clearly for the first time. Daniel hadn't disappeared from my life. He had been replaced. Gradually. Professionally. Completely. By someone whose job required him to belong nowhere fully. That night, I stood in my kitchen again, the same place where this had started, holding the old photograph and the new documents. Two versions of the same man. Both true, and neither entirely mine. I realized then that I was no longer searching for confirmation. I already had it. What I was searching for now was something much harder. Permission. Permission to grieve someone who is still alive. Because once you see the first crack in a lie that big, you understand something that cannot be undone. The truth isn't hiding anymore. It's waiting to see if you're strong enough to look at it directly. I told myself I would be calm. That if I ever spoke to Daniel face to face again, I wouldn't accuse him of anything. I wouldn't mention documents or photographs or names that didn't belong to him. I would just listen. Because when someone has been hiding for decades, the truth doesn't come out under pressure. It comes out through cracks. We met in a place that felt neutral. A cafe near a train station. Somewhere people passed through, but no one stayed long enough to notice anyone else. That choice alone told me more than any document had. Daniel arrived exactly on time. He always did. He looked older, thinner, but not tired. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew where he belonged, even if that place wasn't here. We ordered coffee. He asked about my health. I asked about the weather where he'd been living. Normal questions. Safe questions. But something had changed. I wasn't listening for his words anymore. I was listening for what he avoided. He never mentioned specific locations. Never used names. Never anchored himself to anything concrete. It was like talking to someone standing on ice that could break at any moment. After a few minutes, I said something I hadn't planned. Do you ever think about home? The question hung between us. Daniel looked at his cup for a moment longer than necessary. Then he smiled, gently, carefully. Home is complicated, he said. That answer would have sounded poetic once. Now it sounded rehearsed. I nodded, because pushing him would have ended the conversation immediately. And I didn't want it to end. Not yet. People imagine confrontations as explosive moments. Raised voices. Confessions. Tears. Real confrontations are quieter. They feel like walking through a familiar room after the furniture has been moved. Everything is recognizable. Nothing is comfortable. I decided to test the boundaries. I came across an old photo. I said, "You were standing with someone I didn't recognize." Daniel didn't ask which photo. He didn't ask where I found it. He didn't ask who the other man was. He just looked at me. And in that look, I saw it clearly for the first time. Calculation. Not fear. Not guilt. Assessment. He was deciding how much I knew. And that realization hurt more than any lie. "I don't remember every photograph I've ever taken," he said calmly. That was the moment I understood how different our realities were. I was looking for reassurance. He was managing exposure. I leaned back in my chair. "I called your old office," I said. I watched his face carefully. This time, the pause was longer. Still subtle, but undeniable. "I didn't know you still kept in touch with them," he said. "They didn't have a record of you," I replied. The air between us tightened. Not dramatically, just enough to feel heavy. Daniel took a sip of coffee he no longer needed. "Records disappear," he said, "especially old ones." That was the closest he came to acknowledging anything. And strangely, it was enough. Because innocent people deny. Trained people deflect. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a life built on omission. I lowered my voice. "Daniel," I said, "I just want to understand who you are." For the first time since he sat down, he looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had been holding a position for too long. "There are parts of my life," he said slowly, "that don't belong to anyone else." I waited. He didn't continue. When people refuse to finish a sentence, they're drawing a boundary. And that boundary was firm. Outside the cafe, a train passed. The sound was loud enough to interrupt us, just long enough to give him time to recover his composure. When the noise faded, Daniel stood. "I should go," he said. "I have a connection to catch." Of course he did. He placed money on the table, exact change, and picked up his coat. Before he turned away, I asked one final question. "Were you ever really here?" He stopped, didn't turn around, didn't answer right away. Then he said something I still hear clearly years later. "I was here as much as I was allowed to be." And then he walked away. I stayed seated long after he left, because I knew something important had just happened. That conversation was the most honest one we were ever going to have. Not because he told the truth, but because he confirmed that the truth existed and that it was dangerous. I walked home slowly. Every step felt heavier. Not because I had lost my brother that day, but because I had just confirmed that the version of him I loved was no longer accessible. If it ever had been. That night, I waited for a call. An explanation. A clarification. Something. Nothing came. Days passed. Then weeks. Then silence. And with that silence came something worse than confirmation. Finality. I didn't know where Daniel was. I didn't know what name he was using. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. But I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever life he had chosen, or been pulled into, it did not include space for family anymore. Because family asks questions. And questions are dangerous. I began to understand the real cost of secrecy. It doesn't just divide nations. It divides people. It turns shared history into classified material, and it leaves those on the outside holding memories that no longer fit anywhere. That meeting didn't give me answers, but it gave me something else. Acceptance. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for honesty from someone who survives by avoiding it. Because sometimes the most painful realization isn't that someone lied to you. It's that they were never free enough to tell the truth. And that was the last time I saw my brother. The truth did not arrive dramatically. It didn't come with flashing lights, official letters, or men knocking on my door. It came slowly, through people who didn't know my brother and didn't care about my feelings. That's how truth usually arrives when it has nothing to apologize for. A month after the cafe meeting, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was calm, professional, neutral. "You made some inquiries recently," the man said. "We'd like to clarify a few things." He didn't say who we were. He didn't need to. We agreed to meet in a small government office that looked exactly like every other government office I'd ever seen. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, chairs that were designed to be uncomfortable without being obvious about it. Two men sat across from me. One did the talking. The other took notes. They didn't ask about my brother at first. They asked about me, where I worked, who I spoke to, why I've been asking questions. Their tone was polite, almost apologetic, which made everything worse. Eventually, the man speaking folded his hands and said, "There are certain individuals whose professional activities are difficult to explain." That was his phrase. Difficult to explain. I waited. "We can confirm," he continued, "that your brother operated under multiple identities for a foreign intelligence service." He paused. During the Cold War. The words landed quietly. No music. No dramatic reaction. Just confirmation. I nodded. Not because I was calm, but because I had already done the grieving. "What kind of service?" I asked. He hesitated for the first time. "Soviet." There it was. Not the idea. Not the suspicion. The fact. Daniel was not a misunderstanding. He was not a bureaucratic error. He was a Soviet intelligence operative. Active. Long-term. Embedded. A sleeper. The man continued speaking, but his voice faded behind the noise in my head. 20 years. 20 years of dinners, phone calls, holidays. 20 years of believing proximity meant honesty. I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because the truth was good, but because uncertainty was finally over. "What happens now?" I asked. The man exchanged a glance with his colleague. "For you," he said. "Nothing." "For him?" I asked. "That depends on where he is," he replied. "And where is he?" Another pause. "We don't know." That answer frightened me more than any file ever could. The meeting ended without ceremony. No paperwork. No signatures. No instructions. Just a polite reminder not to discuss the conversation. As if I needed one. On the way home, I stopped at a grocery store. People were buying bread, talking about weather, arguing over cereal. Life was continuing aggressively normally. That felt wrong. I kept thinking there should be some visible sign that something fundamental had changed. There wasn't. At home, I pulled out every photograph I had of Daniel. Not to analyze, just to look, to confirm that he had existed in my life the way I remembered. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. In every photo, he was slightly turned away from the camera, never fully facing it, as if he had already been practicing distance. Over the next few weeks, small pieces of the story came together through people who had no emotional connection to it. A former analyst mentioned a code name. A retired official confirmed timelines. A journalist hinted at a long-term infiltration program that matched Daniel's movements exactly. Each piece made the picture clearer and colder. Daniel hadn't been improvising. He had been executing. He hadn't been hiding. He had been placed. The hardest part wasn't accepting that he had lied. It was accepting that he had done it well. That he had built a life convincing enough to deceive not just governments, but family. I began questioning myself. Had I been useful to him? Had he reported on me? On our parents? On our conversations? The officials insisted there was no evidence of that. But doubt doesn't need evidence to survive. It just needs proximity. One evening, I found an old voicemail. Daniel's voice. Casual. Warm. I listened to it 3 times. And for the first time, I wondered if even his affection had been measured. Or if some part of him had genuinely wanted to stay connected. That question hurt more than the truth. Because it suggested he had lived divided. And division destroys people from the inside out. The Cold War ended shortly after. Flags changed. Borders shifted. News anchors talked about peace. But none of that reached my living room. Because personal wars don't end when treaties are signed. They end when people stop waiting. I never heard from Daniel again. No letter. No call. No explanation. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The anger faded. The shock settled. What remained was grief. Not for a dead man, but for a relationship that had never been allowed to fully exist. Years later, I asked one of the officials a question I had avoided. Did he have a choice? The man considered it. Everyone has a choice, he said. But some choices come with consequences that remove all other options. That was the closest thing to mercy anyone ever offered. I don't know what Daniel believed. I don't know what he justified to himself. All I know is this. He lived his life as a function, not a person. And everyone who loved him paid for that function in ways history will never record. Because governments write reports, but families carry silence. And silence is heavier than any classified file. Time does something strange to secrets. At first, they feel explosive. Then they feel heavy. Eventually, they feel distant. Not because they matter less, but because you've learned how to carry them. Years passed after I learned the truth about Daniel. The Cold War ended. Flags changed. Headlines moved on. But the past doesn't disappear just because history closes a chapter. It waits. I stopped expecting to hear from him. That was the first real step toward peace. Because hope, when it has no destination, becomes another form of suffering. People would sometimes ask about my brother. Casually. At family gatherings. At work. In conversations where they expected a simple answer. How's your brother doing? For a long time, I didn't know what to say. He lives abroad. He works in government. He's complicated. None of those were lies. They just weren't complete. Eventually, I learned that most people don't want the truth. They want closure that fits inside a sentence. I never had that. What I had were memories. And memories, I discovered, are stubborn. They don't update themselves when new information arrives. They remain exactly as they were when they were formed. I would still remember Daniel teaching me how to ride a bike. Still remember him standing at the edge of the schoolyard, watching to make sure I got home safely. Still remember the way he listened, really listened, when I talked about things that felt important only to me. Those memories didn't vanish when I learned he was a Soviet spy. They became complicated, but they didn't become false. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Because if I allowed myself to believe that everything had been a lie, then I would have to erase my own past. And I wasn't willing to do that. One afternoon, years later, I received a small package. No return address. Just my name, written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a photograph. 2 boys, standing in front of our childhood house. The image was faded, creased, old. On the back, a single line had been written. Some parts of us survive, even the roles we're forced to play. I sat with that photograph for a long time, not trying to decode it, not trying to forgive or condemn, just letting it exist. Because sometimes the last thing a story gives you is not an answer, but permission. Permission to hold 2 truths at once. Daniel had betrayed a country. That much was clear, but he had also been my brother. And both of those things could be true without canceling each other out. That realization didn't excuse his choices, but it allowed me to stop defining him by a single word. Enemy, traitor, spy. Those words belong to history books. They're useful. They're efficient. They're incomplete. History needs labels. Families need understanding. I began to think about the life Daniel must have lived. The constant monitoring, the rehearsed conversations, the careful emotional distance, living under a name that wasn't yours, belonging to a place that could never fully claim you. That kind of life doesn't make monsters. It makes people who are permanently divided, and division is its own punishment. I realized then that Daniel had lost something long before I ever did. He had lost the ability to be known honestly, to exist without calculation, to love without risk. That doesn't make him innocent, but it makes him human. And humanity is where judgment becomes complicated. There is a temptation, especially in stories like this, to look for villains and victims. But real life is rarely that clean. Sometimes the villain is a system. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's a choice made too early to reverse. If there is one thing I've learned, it's this. People don't vanish all at once. They disappear in pieces. A lie here, a silence there, a role played too long, until eventually, even they don't know where the performance ends. I never learned what happened to Daniel after that final message. Maybe he lived out his days quietly. Maybe he disappeared into another identity. Maybe he carried the same memories I did. I hope he did. Because if he remembered our childhood the way I do, then some part of him remained untouched by the world that used him. And that matters. When I think about him now, I don't think about intelligence files or geopolitical consequences. I think about 2 brothers sharing a room. One window, one radio, a world outside that felt big and dangerous, and a home that felt safe. That version of us was real, and no government can take that away. The Cold War taught the world many lessons about power, ideology, and fear. but it also taught a quieter lesson, that the deepest damage isn't always measured in casualties or borders. Sometimes it's measured in families who will never fully understand each other again. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Not every betrayal is born from cruelty. Some are born from pressure, survival, and systems that don't care who they break. That doesn't make them right, but it reminds us to be careful with our judgments. Because behind every classified file is a human being, and behind every human being is a story that doesn't fit neatly into history. Daniel was a Soviet spy. That is how the world would remember him. But to me, he will always be something else. My brother. And that truth, unlike his secrets, is not something I will ever give up. As we close this story, ask yourself, what would you do if the person you trusted most in life was living a secret you could never have imagined? Could you forgive someone who was forced to live a divided life, even if it meant betraying your trust? How well do we really know the people closest to us? Daniel's story isn't just about espionage or Cold War secrets. It's about family. It's about trust. And it's about the invisible cost of the choices people make when the world demands something they cannot refuse. The impact of secrets like his isn't just geopolitical, it's personal. It ripples through the lives of everyone who loves them, leaving questions that never fully go away. If you found yourself captivated by Daniel's story, don't stop here. We've uncovered other incredible true stories of hidden lives, secret identities, and Cold War mysteries. Stories that will make you question history, trust, and the people around you. Click the next video to see how a single lost briefcase nearly triggered World War III. The story of a CIA agent who lived for years as a gardener inside a KGB chief's home. And the secret life of a family member who wasn't who you thought they were. Your curiosity brought you here, let it take you further. Watch the next story now and uncover the hidden truths history didn't want you to know.